Could a strange substance be part of a government test? Well, that's the question at the heart of a phenomenon called chemtrails, now getting widespread attention.
They begin as normal contrails from a jet engine, but do not fade away like a normal contrail.
High cloud, or so-called contrails.
It turns out until 9 years ago, the government had the right under U.S. law to conduct secret testing on the American public under specific conditions.
It seemed like some mornings it was just crisscrossing the whole sky. It was just like a giant checkerboard.
A high level of barium, 6.8 parts per million, more than 3 times the toxic level set by the EPA.
Now, Jeff's report mentioned high levels of barium linked to those alleged chemtrails. We wanted to find out exactly what effects barium has on the body.
There's already no shortage of unclassified weather modification programs by the government. Chemtrails are even mentioned by name in the initial draft of House Bill 2977 under the Space Preservation Act. But the military denies any such program exists.
And you know, it turns out until 9 years ago, the government had the right under U.S. law to conduct secret testing on the American public under specific conditions.
We live in a time where there is an unprecedented amount of information available to anyone that has access to the internet. 24-hour news coverage, internet access to any type of entertainment or detailed information we are looking for, and of course our smartphones that the majority of the population have access to and use every hour of every day. With all this information bombarding our lives, it is easy to see why we are more interested in a continuous stream of information rather than the events that are occurring around us. We are at a point as humans where we need a continuous stream of information to stimulate our minds through watching, listening, and interacting with technology. It is this very technology that is distracting us from seeing what is happening in our environment and in our skies. Is it possible that these technologies are designed to distract us? The fact is that if we are always staring at a screen with our heads down, why would we have any cause to look up? If the purpose is designed around distraction, we must ask ourselves the obvious question: why?
Any failure traceable to arrogance or our lack of comprehension or readiness to sacrifice would inflict upon us grievous hurt, both at home and abroad. Progress toward these noble goals is persistently threatened by the conflict now engulfing the world. There is call for not so much the emotional and transitory sacrifices of crisis, but rather those which enable us to carry forward steadily, surely, and without complaint, the burdens of a prolonged and complex struggle with liberty the stake. Only thus shall we remain, despite every provocation, on our charted course toward permanent peace and human betterment. Crises there will continue to be. In meeting them, whether foreign or domestic, great or small, there is a recurring temptation to feel that some spectacular and costly action could become the miraculous solution to all current difficulties. A huge increase in newer elements of our defenses, development of unrealistic programs to cure every ill in agriculture, a dramatic expansion in basic and applied research. These and many other possibilities, each possibly promising in itself, may be suggested as the only way to the road we wish to travel. But each proposal must be weighed in the light of a broader consideration: the need to maintain balance in and among national programs. Balance between the private and the public economy. Balance between the cost and hoped for advantages. balance between the clearly necessary and the comfortably desirable, balance between our essential requirements as a nation and the duties imposed by the nation upon the individual, balance between actions of the moment and the national welfare of the future. Good judgment seeks balance in progress. Lack of it eventually finds imbalance and frustration. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together. Akin to and largely responsible for the sweeping changes in our industrial military posture has been the technological revolution during recent decades. In this revolution, research has become central. It also becomes more formalized, complex, and costly. A steadily increasing share is conducted for, by, or at the direction of the federal government. Today, the solitary inventor, tinkering in his shop, has been overshadowed by task forces of scientists in laboratories and testing fields. In the same fashion, the free university, historically the fountainhead of free ideas and scientific discovery, has experienced a revolution in the conduct of research. Partly because of the huge costs involved, a government contract becomes virtually a substitute for intellectual curiosity.
By definition, contrails are line-shaped clouds produced by aircraft or rocket engine exhaust or changes in air pressure, typically at high altitudes above the Earth's surface. Contrails are composed primarily of water in the form of ice crystals. The combination of water vapor in aircraft engine exhaust and the low ambient temperature at high altitude allows for the formation of these trails. Depending on the temperature and humidity at high altitudes, they may be visible for a few seconds or minutes, or may persist for hours, and spread to be several miles wide, resembling a natural cirrus or altocumulus cloud. These contrails that persist are of particular interest to scientists because they increase the cloudiness of the atmosphere. It was not until 2017 that these clouds were defined by scientists as Homo mutatus clouds. In this documentary, we will explore geoengineering, HAARP, and Project Solar Shield. Some will call these subjects a conspiracy theory, while others will call it fact.
First, I would start with the fact that we at geoengineeringwatch.org, the largest website in the world on the subject, don't recognize the chemtrails term. Semantics is important because if people search that term, they find conspiracy theory and hoax by design. So we advise sticking to the climate science terms: climate engineering, geoengineering, solar radiation management. In regard to the proof we have, in addition to having government documents, Senate documents, presidential documents, we have U.S. Air Force former generals, 2 former generals communicating with us. We have NASA satellite imagery like that, which you're showing right now, that clearly no one needs to know anything about meteorology to see that there's very unnatural patterns in those cloud formations, in fact, patterns that nature cannot make. In addition to our testing of precipitation from around the globe, which has yielded without exception the climate engineering components in the precipitation, aluminum, barium, strontium, polymer fibers. We have just at great expense and great effort completed atmospheric testing using a flying laboratory that NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, also uses, and we have just confirmed the same climate engineering elements that were emitted from aircraft in a layer that we flew through. We have just confirmed this, first type of its test ever.
Climate change, global warming, is a real threat to our civilization. Scientists have been discussing climate modification using aerosols and so on in the upper atmosphere. But unfortunately, conspiracy theorists have latched onto this and gone further. There is no evidence that anyone is actually spraying chemicals in the atmosphere to alter the world's climate. Now, those video clips we saw were a phenomenon called aerodynamic condensation. Now, at low levels and high humidity, where there is a drop of atmospheric pressure, like over the wings or from wingtip vortices, there is a drop in temperature, and that will cause condensation. And it's very commonly seen around airports on rainy days. The chemtrails that people are talking about are the condensation trails from engine exhaust.
We have film footage of these aircraft at altitude turning on and off. You can't turn condensation on and off with the nozzles visible. As you see in that particular image you're showing now, you can see the nozzles on the wings. We have up-close photographs as well. If people don't believe what they see with their own eyes, I think there's not much we can show them. Militaries around the globe, starting with the U.S. military, state emphatically and on the record that the greatest national security threat of all is the climate collapse. What we face is far worse than global warming. We face what's more scientifically termed an abrupt climate collapse. The stated scientific purpose, and by the way, we have every science institution, every climate science institution around the globe discussing exactly what we see in our skies as something that needs to be done immediately to spray light scattering particles into the sky to block some of the sun's incoming thermal energy. So this is the stated purpose of solar radiation management, stratospheric aerosol injection, cloud albedo enhancement, to spray light blocking particles into the sky. I have a fully off-grid home that was on the cover of the world's largest renewable energy magazine, and I was losing extraordinary amounts of my solar power uptake from whatever these aircraft were emitting, and clearly condensation cannot block that much of the sun. So we knew there was a problem. We began testing, and we were astounded at the amount of data that was available that official sources were not discussing. And by the way, they're not discussing it because in one case we have a federal gag order, an illegal federal gag order in the U.S. gagging all the nation's weathermen. I think we should ask ourselves why that's going on. Again, everything we see in the sky is exactly what is described by climate scientists. We're not asking anybody to believe us. We're asking them to look at the photographs of nozzles, film footage, government documents, statements from former military, and when we consider the degree of danger of climate collapse, would we really expect governments around the globe to ask our permission before deploying this program?
What is HAARP? Why is it important? And what are the effects on both the atmosphere and the weather? In 1990, the U.S. Congress directed the Navy and the Air Force to construct HAARP, as well as manage the facility.
This facility was built by the Air Force about 20 years ago to study the ionosphere, to do active experiments in the ionosphere. The ionosphere is a layer that surrounds the Earth at about 100 kilometers up to maybe 2,000 kilometers. It's important for a lot of things, like satellite communication. Any kind of radio signals that pass through the ionosphere are affected by the ionosphere. Each of these trailers you see around me have transmitters in them. The transmitters feed power from the main building over there up into these dipole antennas. And basically there are 180 antennas radiating high frequency waves up in the ionosphere. It's a big ham radio, a big HF radio, the biggest in the world. Fundamentally what this is about is taking the ionosphere at 100 kilometers up and turning it into a laboratory. We can do experiments. We can create bubbles. We can heat small sections. can create waves, we can excite plasma resonances and do a lot of experiments. We can transmit signals all around the world. We can study effects of the ionosphere. It basically makes the ionosphere a laboratory, and we can do experiments that no one else can do. It's a laboratory without walls.
We were led to believe that the main purpose of HAARP was to study the effects that bursts of high radio frequencies into the ionosphere would have on satellite communication. However, the main purpose of HAARP is not that simple.
There have been some reports that Stanford University was somewhat involved in some of the installations and some of the research. And according to some of the maps, there are other locations of either transmitters or antennas around the globe. Is that a possibility? Is this within the scope of HAARP, or how would that work?
Oh, yes. There's been a number of facilities, similar facilities actually referenced going way back. You can go back to the original transmitters, which were referred to in the old days as ionospheric heaters. And these actually go back and trace their roots to the former Soviet Union. There were 5 transmitters that were operating in the 1970s that were responsible for what was called the woodpecker signal, which was something that ham radio operators around the world picked up. And what they realized was triangulating the positions. They went back to the former Soviet Union. These transmitters created interference in radio frequency, but also were attributed at that time to perhaps weather anomalies, power grid failures, even health effects. Not much was really paid attention to in the 70s, but as we developed our technology going into the 80s and 90s, those issues became sort of resurrected. There's also a set of transmitters in Europe, the EasyCat system. There's a transmitter, series transmitters across the Canada. There's some in Arecibo, Puerto Rico that I'm aware of, and even the Chinese government have indicated installations in Antarctica and other locations. So others are aggressively pursuing the research, and I'm sure by now there's probably additional experiments going on in other countries with the scientific base to begin work in this area.
Consider for a moment the next interview in this film. The subtle comments and information given to you here should tell you clearly that climate change technology has been taking place and continues to build over time. If you consider the confidence in which this information is reported, you have to conclude it to be true. Listen carefully to the truth being revealed to you, then retract it quickly with the word allegedly.
You know, they were talking about climate change yesterday, and now we're learning that scientists and researchers are looking at how to change the weather on purpose. That's right. Lasers now could one day manipulate rain and lightning. Lasers? Really? To change the weather?
That's right. Well, as Mark Twain once famously said, everyone complains about the weather, but no one ever does anything about it. Well, instead of doing a rain dance, we physicists are firing trillion-watt lasers into the sky to actually precipitate rain clouds and actually bring down lightning bolts. This is potentially a game changer.
But this is experimental.
It's experimental. However, in the laboratory so far it works. When you have water vapor and you have dust particles or ice crystals, you can precipitate rain. It condenses around the seeds. These seeds can also be created by laser beams. By firing trillion-watt lasers, you rip apart the electrons, creating what are called ions, and these ions act like seeds, like dust particles, bringing down rain and even lightning.
In the Earth, to a certain extent, if you can find these triggering frequencies, you can create a much different and much dramatic effect, which becomes the root of a lot of the science and also the risk associated with what appear to be benign uses, earth-penetrating tomography as examples, but at the same time produce a powerful either deliberate or side effect in terms of what it can do to either environmental systems or human beings. And this was really the big concern that we started with when you start talking about taking an instrument on the ground like HAARP and literally plugging it in, coupling it with energetic systems of the Earth in order to manipulate them. That's what caused us the primary concern from the very beginning, and it continues to cause a great deal of concern.
Well, Well, this fascinates me in part because, too, I remember reading the stories that China had used this during the Olympics, that the USSR had used this after Chernobyl to create rain clouds. I mean, did those really work then? We have some of these capabilities now?
Inconclusive. Even in the 60s, the CIA used this to bring down monsoons during the Vietnam War, to wash out the Viet Cong. Governments have been playing with this thing.
Alleged to.
Alleged to, right.
Yeah.
When you think about creating these kinds of events, there was actually an international treaty signed back in the 1970s to not use environmental manipulation.
We realize that for decades now, these governments have been alleged to have experimented with weather control, but nothing conclusive. This time we're bringing in the laws of physics rather than simply waving our hands and uttering mumbo jumbo. We're actually using trillion-watt lasers now. And in the laboratory, sure enough, they precipitate rain out of water vapor. Sure enough, you can actually bring down electricity down the beam.
So what does it mean for drought areas that need to have rain for crops? And if they don't have them, there's the consequences of famine.
The droughts that you're experiencing in the Balkans, throughout Europe, the United States, around the world, could be a combination, actually, of both natural and man-made factors. I don't buy into, personally, that man is somehow responsible for the entire trend of climate change and global warming. I believe most of it's natural. Man is augmenting that with our own technologies. And then when you talk about these high technologies, these ideas of deliberate manipulation, yes, all those things are possible. The difficulty is tracking it directly to these systems. The kind of signals that HAARP and other transmitters produce are coherent, rhythmic, obviously man-made signals when measured against the background randomness of nature. These can be picked out if the scientists within countries are sophisticated enough to analyze the spectrum and take a look at what's happening there.
Well, the bad news is if it's a clear blue sky, it's not going to do anything at all, because it only takes water vapor that's already in the air and condenses it. However, for floods, for agriculture, farmers, for people planning wedding parties, football games, you name it, outdoor events and agriculture and flooding and even hurricanes, all of them could be subject to weather modification.
Anything briefly that you can mention about chemtrails?
Yeah, chemtrails has come up, and this is the idea of chemical spraying from aircraft for some specific purpose, and a lot of that got hooked into HAARP, and it was primarily one of the early researchers looking for a way to bring attention to his topic. And I can tell you, HAARP does not need anything else. I mean, if you sprayed certain elemental particles in the atmosphere and then utilized HAARP to trigger some effect on those, certainly you can do that through techniques that capitalize on the radiochemistry of mixing specific chemicals in the upper atmosphere and then using radio frequency energy to trigger various kinds of anomalous events. You can certainly do that. It's not necessary. As I said, HAARP has the ability to swing through a very broad spectrum, can do things directly and deliberately. Without that, is it possible that the chemtrails is associated in some instances? Absolutely, yes. Could things be enhanced chemically? And the answer is yes. As an example, you can place a very, very small amount of a particular material within an environment, and then you can trigger energy that actually stimulates the body's reaction to those elements. As an example, we all have a certain amount of iodine in our bodies, but if we send radio frequency energy in, as an example, that resonates at the frequency of iodine, even though the actual amount in our bodies is below, say, a poisoning level or a threat level for the body. In fact, it's necessary for maintaining certain body functions. But if you send energy in and you trick the body into thinking it's just been overloaded with this chemical, it will display all of the symptoms of the chemical poisoning. And yet, when they do the blood work, it's just not there. The chemistry is not there, so it goes down as a mystery illness. This kind of thing can be easily done with introducing some chemical into the environment through spraying, as an example, and then triggering events so that you're only getting the population that's been so affected in the rest of the world, so to speak.
a listen to this. So what are you hearing? Well, we don't really know. The strange sounds were heard across Terrace, BC early yesterday morning and lasted for about 10 minutes. Speculation about what caused it ranges from the aurora borealis to aliens, or it could just be a prank. But similar sounds have been recorded in other parts of BC and reported in other locations around the world.
Saturday morning, spinning. It's a weird noise, sounds like a metallic noise.
El 5 de abril, 2:55 de la madrugada, una vez más, el zumbido y los estruendos.
We are entering into a phase of humankind that will take us further into the unknown. A place we could never have imagined 10 or 20 years ago. Advances in technology in unison with the military-industrial complex allows the deep state to attempt new things that have never been tried before. The information we are allowed to see by design is deceptive, wrapped in conspiracy theories and tied up with a cancel culture bow that will shut us down for pointing out an alternative to anything out of the ordinary that we hear or see. If we are being told that something is not taking place or is tagged a conspiracy, you can be sure that it is happening, and it has for some time. It is a fact that most people dismiss anything strange that they see in our skies. With the information we have at our fingertips every day, it is hard to sift through what is fact or what is fake. In most cases, the population will deny everything they see unless government officials say that it's true. Consider this. Even if your government told you what you have seen is fact, would you believe it? The answer is obvious. Even with absolute truth, the population will deny it as a conspiracy. What is Project Solar Shield? In simplest terms, it is the idea that distributing particulates in the upper atmosphere will cool down the planet to pre-industrial era, and cost very little to do so. It is possible that other technologies are or can be deployed in space that will result in the same effect. A sun shield would divert rays from the sun, reducing heat and solar radiation on Earth. It's been proposed for decades by scientists, and one day could become a reality. In order to do this, it would have to involve every country on the planet. The sun shield would be created by sending small rockets into space. They would have incredibly thin mirrors that would connect together to make one massive lens to reflect sun away from the Earth. This shield would be half the size of the Earth and located 1 million miles away from the planet. The shield would reduce the global temperature by 1 degree. As more mirrors were added, the temperature would be reduced gradually over time. If something went wrong with the shield, the consequences would be devastating. The shield would need to be monitored closely and adjusted from time to time to ensure that it stays in its fixed position in space. Should the shield malfunction, the consequences to the planet would be devastating. The global temperature change would happen within months and shock everything and everyone on the planet. Is it possible this shield is already in place? Ask yourself this question. Would world governments inform the population if this tech was being used? The answer is obvious.
Why a good test of any sort of theory goes back to Cicero. Who benefits? Why would the government be using aeroplanes to poison its own population or change the climate? It seems like a very convoluted and inefficient way, for one thing, of doing anything. And why would they want to do it anyway and then cover it up?
First, in regard to your stated objective of poisoning the population, you said that, I didn't.
Okay.
That's not what we have stated at geoengineeringwatch.org. In regard to engineering the climate, I'll answer in their words. Militaries around the globe, starting with the U.S. military, state emphatically and on the record that the greatest national security threat of all is the climate collapse. What we face is far worse than global warming. We face what's more scientifically termed an abrupt climate collapse. The stated scientific purpose, and by the way, we have every science institution, every climate science institution around the globe discussing exactly what we see in our skies as something that needs to be done immediately to spray light scattering particles into the sky to block some of the sun's incoming thermal energy.
You can either believe that your government has your best interest in mind or not. There are, however, unfortunate facts that the population chooses to ignore. There is one thing that will remain fact. The media will continue to censor what they believe you should know and see. Anything that does not fit in their narrative will be tagged a conspiracy, and the population will follow as usual. Governments around the globe will continue to deceive you with your full permission, and when the truth is revealed, you will choose to ignore it and call it fake, even if the evidence is right in front of you. The truth is what you believe it to be, regardless of the facts or lack of it. Everyone sees a different truth because everyone is creating what they see.